On the night of March 27th to 28th, 1942, a British naval force departed Falmouth Harbour on the southwestern coast of England. The flotilla consisted of 1 destroyer, 18 motor launches, 1 motor gunboat, and 2 escort destroyers. Their destination was St. Nazaire, a heavily fortified German naval base on the Atlantic coast of occupied France, some 400 miles distant. This operation, designated Chariot, represented one of the most audacious combined operations conceived by British planners during the Second World War. The objective was straightforward in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. Destroy the Normandie Dock at St. Nazaire, the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing Germany's largest battleships. The destroyer leading this force was HMS Campbeltown, formerly the American destroyer USS Buchanan, transferred to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. Campbeltown had been extensively modified. Her superstructure was cut down to resemble a German Merl-class torpedo boat. 4 of her original 4 funnels were removed. Most significantly, her bow was packed with 24 depth charges containing approximately 4.5 tons of high explosives, fitted with delayed action fuses. The ship herself was the primary weapon. Commander Robert Ryder commanded the naval force. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman commanded the commando element, consisting of No. 2 Commando and specialized detachments from other units. In total, 612 men participated in the operation. Their mission was to penetrate 5 miles up the Loire estuary, ram the Normandie Dock gates with Campbeltown, land commandos to destroy dock machinery and facilities, then withdraw before German forces could organize an effective response. The strategic context that made this operation necessary begins with the threat posed by German capital ships to Allied Atlantic convoys. By early 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a critical phase. German U-boats were sinking merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Between January and June 1942, U-boats would sink over 500 Allied ships in the Atlantic, a rate of approximately 3 vessels per day. This posed an existential threat to Britain, which depended on maritime imports for food, fuel, and war materials. However, German submarines were not the only naval threat. The German Navy possessed several large surface warships capable of devastating convoy operations. In May 1941, the battleship Bismarck had broken out into the Atlantic, sinking the battlecruiser HMS Hood before being hunted down and destroyed. The incident demonstrated the threat posed by German capital ships operating against commerce. By early 1942, Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz, was operational and stationed in Norwegian waters. Tirpitz displaced over 52,000 tons at full load, carried 8 15-inch guns, and could achieve a speed of 30 knots. If Tirpitz broke out into the Atlantic to attack convoys, the Royal Navy would be forced to divert substantial forces to hunt her, leaving convoy routes exposed to U-boat attack. British naval planners understood that Tirpitz represented a fleet in being. Even if she never fired her guns, her existence tied down British naval assets that could not be deployed elsewhere. The question became how to neutralize this threat without engaging in a costly naval battle in Norwegian waters where German air power dominated. The answer lay in St. Nazaire. The port of St. Nazaire, located on the Atlantic coast of France at the mouth of the Loire River, had been developed extensively in the 1930s. The Normandie Dock, also called the Forme Écluse Louis Joubert, was constructed specifically to service the French ocean liner SS Normandie, one of the largest passenger ships in the world. The dock measured approximately 1,000 feet in length, 164 feet in width, and more than 50 feet in depth. It could accommodate vessels displacing up to 85,000 tons. Critically, it was the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast large enough to service a ship the size of Tirpitz. If Tirpitz ventured into the Atlantic and sustained damage from British forces, her only realistic option for repairs would be the St. Nazaire dock. Without access to this facility, Tirpitz would have to return to Germany through the English Channel or around the north of Scotland, both routes heavily contested by British naval and air forces. Therefore, if the Normandie Dock could be destroyed, Tirpitz would effectively be contained in Norwegian waters, unable to risk Atlantic operations. This strategic calculus led to the conception of Operation Chariot. The plan was developed by Combined Operations Headquarters under the direction of Lord Louis Mountbatten. Planning began in late 1941 and continued through the winter. The operation required precise intelligence regarding dock dimensions, German defensive positions, tidal conditions, and navigation hazards in the Loire estuary. The plan called for a direct assault. An expendable destroyer would be loaded with explosives and sailed directly into St. Nazaire harbor. The ship would ram the dock gates at high speed, embedding itself in the structure. Delayed action fuses would detonate the explosives hours later, after German engineers had been lulled into believing the ship posed no explosive threat. Simultaneously, Commandos would land and destroy pumping stations, winding gear, and other dock machinery essential for dry dock operations. The combined effect would render the facility inoperable for years. The challenges were substantial. St. Nazaire was heavily defended. German forces maintained coastal artillery batteries, anti-aircraft guns, machine gun positions, and infantry garrisons. The harbor entrance was 5 miles from the Normandie Dock, requiring the force to navigate up the Loire estuary under fire. The estuary contained numerous navigation hazards, including sandbanks and shallow waters. The operation would need to be conducted at night during high tide to provide sufficient water depth for the vessels. Furthermore, even if the force successfully reached the dock and completed demolitions, extraction would be extremely difficult. The motor launches carrying the Commandos were wooden vessels with minimal armor protection. They would be highly vulnerable to German fire during withdrawal. Planners estimated a 50% chance of achieving the primary objective, but significantly lower odds for most participants to return to England. Despite these challenges, the operation was approved. The potential strategic gain, neutralizing Tirpitz without risking major fleet units, justified the risk. Selection and training of personnel began in February 1942. Commander Robert Edward Dudley Ryder was selected to command the naval force. Born in 1898, Ryder had extensive experience with small craft operations and had previously commanded vessels in the Mediterranean. He volunteered for the St. Nazaire operation despite being briefed on the low probability of survival. Lieutenant Colonel Augustus Charles Newman, known as Charles Newman, commanded the military force. Newman led No. 2 Commando and was responsible for organizing the assault teams and demolition parties. His task was coordinating the land operations, securing the dock area, destroying designated targets, and fighting a defensive action to allow maximum time for demolitions before withdrawal. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Haldon Beatty commanded HMS Campbeltown. Beatty's responsibility was navigating the ship up the Loire estuary and ramming the dock gates at precisely the correct angle and speed to cause maximum structural damage. After ramming, he would evacuate his crew and join the commando withdrawal. The commando force was organized into specialized groups. Demolition teams were assigned specific targets: the northern winding house, the southern winding house, pumping stations, and various dock machinery. Each team trained extensively on mock-ups of their objectives, constructed from intelligence photographs and reports. Protection teams were assigned to defend the demolition parties while they worked. Assault teams would clear German defensive positions and secure the immediate area. HMS Campbeltown underwent extensive modifications at Devonport during March 1942. The ship had been built in 1919 and was nearing the end of her service life, making her expendable for this operation. Her superstructure was cut down to alter her silhouette. 4 of her 4 funnels were removed, with the remaining funnels angled to resemble those of German torpedo boats. Additional armor plating was installed around critical positions, though this provided only minimal protection against heavy-caliber weapons. The explosive charge was installed in a specially constructed steel chamber in the forward section of the ship, positioned to direct the blast downward and forward into the dock gate structure when detonated. 24 Mark 7 depth charges, each containing 290 pounds of amatol explosive, were arranged to maximize destructive effect. The fusing mechanism consisted of pencil fuses with an 8-hour delay, though this could be adjusted. Backup fuses were installed in case the primary system failed. The motor launches were standard Fayemal B-class vessels, approximately 115 feet in length, powered by twin diesel engines. Each could carry approximately 15 to 18 commandos, in addition to the naval crew. The launches were wooden-hulled, providing no protection against gunfire. Their primary advantages were shallow draft, allowing them to navigate the Loire estuary and speed of approximately 20 knots. Motor gunboat 314 would accompany the force. This vessel, larger and more heavily armed than the motor launches, would carry Commander Ryder and serve as a command vessel. She mounted a 2-pounder pom-pom gun forward and various machine guns. Able seaman William Savage was assigned as gunlayer for the pom-pom. Training continued through March. The Commandos rehearsed their assault and demolition procedures repeatedly. Naval crews practiced formation sailing and night navigation. Coordination between naval and military elements was refined through joint exercises. By late March, the force was considered ready. The operation was scheduled to coincide with specific tidal conditions. High tide was necessary to provide sufficient water depth in the Loire estuary. Additionally, planners hoped for darkness throughout the approach and assault, with dawn breaking only after the force had withdrawn. Weather conditions, particularly wind and visibility, would also be critical factors. On March 26th, final briefings were conducted. All personnel were informed of the full scope of the operation. The high-risk nature of the mission was acknowledged. Volunteers were given a final opportunity to withdraw. None did. Equipment was loaded, weapons checked, and final preparations completed. The force departed Falmouth Harbor on the afternoon of March 27, 1942. The flotilla sailed in formation. HMS Campbeltown leading, followed by the motor gun boat and motor launches in 2 columns. 2 fleet destroyers, HMS Tynedale and HMS Atherstone, provided escort for the initial phase of the crossing. The weather was favorable, with moderate seas and good visibility. The crossing proceeded without significant incident through the daylight hours of March 27th. German reconnaissance aircraft were sighted, but apparently took the force for a routine coastal convoy, not warranting special attention. This was fortunate, as an alert would have given St. Nazaire's defenders time to prepare. As evening approached, the force maintained course toward the French coast. At approximately 2200 hours, the 2 escort destroyers turned back toward England as planned. Their presence close to the French coast would have aroused suspicion. From this point forward, the raiding force was on its own, with no reinforcements available and no possibility of heavy fire support. Navigation through the night relied on dead reckoning and coastal landmarks. The force had to locate the Loire estuary entrance, then navigate approximately 5 miles upriver to St. Nazaire. The Loire contained numerous sandbanks and shallow areas. Charts were available, but not entirely reliable. The designated navigator aboard the motor gun boat used a combination of depth soundings, compass bearings, and visual references to maintain the correct course. The approach to the estuary mouth was made in darkness. Around midnight, the force altered formation. Campbeltown moved to the front, with motor gun boat 314 close behind. The motor launches formed up in 2 columns astern. This formation would allow Campbeltown to lead the penetration of the harbor, with the launches following to land commandos at designated points. At approximately 0100 hours on March 28th, the force entered the Loire estuary. Speed was reduced to minimize wake and noise. Lookouts scanned for German patrol boats and shore-based searchlights. The shallow water and narrow channel required careful navigation. Any grounding would be disastrous. By 01:15 hours, the flotilla was well into the estuary, proceeding upriver towards St. Nazaire. The lights of the port were visible ahead. German installations ashore showed no signs of alert. The deception plan appeared to be working. Campbeltown's altered silhouette and the use of German recognition signals might allow the force to approach close to the dock before being identified as hostile. At 01:20 hours, German shore stations began challenging the approaching ships with signal lamps. A German-speaking signalman aboard Campbeltown responded using captured German signal codes. He transmitted messages indicating that the ships were German vessels returning from combat operations and requesting permission to enter harbor. The exchanges continued as Campbeltown closed the distance to the harbor entrance. German headquarters received the signals but remained uncertain. The ship's silhouettes appeared correct for German vessels, and the recognition codes seemed authentic. However, British air activity over St. Nazaire earlier that evening had placed defenses on heightened alert. Officers ashore debated whether to open fire or allow the ships to proceed. The decisive moment came at approximately 01:27 hours. A German officer on shore, Captain Sir C. Karl Conrad Meck, concluded that the approaching ships were British. He ordered all coastal defense batteries to open fire immediately. Within seconds, the entire German defensive system activated. Coastal artillery, anti-aircraft guns positioned for ground targets, machine gun nests, and rifle fire converged on the approaching flotilla. Tracer ammunition created streams of light across the water. High explosive shells began bracketing the ships with water spouts. The battle for St. Nazaire had begun. At 01:28 hours, Campbeltown ran down the German flags she had been flying and raised the white ensign. All British ships opened fire with their available weapons. The range closed rapidly. Campbeltown accelerated to full speed, approximately 17 knots, aiming directly for the Normandie Dock gates. The scene became one of intense fire and confusion. German guns concentrated on Campbeltown, the largest and most obvious target. Shells struck the ship repeatedly. The bridge was hit, killing and wounding several officers. Commander Beatty, though wounded, maintained his position and kept the ship on course. The forward gun positions were targeted heavily. Able seaman William Savage, manning the pom-pom gun aboard the motor gun boat, engaged German positions despite being completely exposed to enemy fire. The motor launches following behind Campbeltown came under equally heavy fire. The wooden-hulled vessels were highly vulnerable. Several launches were hit immediately and caught fire. Others were disabled and began drifting. The carefully planned landing schedule began to disintegrate as launches were sunk or forced to withdraw. Campbeltown continued her charge toward the dock. The range decreased to 200 yards, then 100 yards. German gunners fired at point-blank range. The ship's structure was being torn apart, but her engines continued running and her steering remained functional. At 01:34 hours, March 28, 1942, HMS Campbeltown struck the southern caisson of the Normandie Dock at a speed of 17 knots. The impact drove the ship's bow 36 feet into the dock gate structure, wedging her firmly in place. The explosive charges, positioned precisely where British planners had calculated they would cause maximum damage, were now embedded in the critical structural elements of the dock. The fuses were activated, set to detonate in approximately 8 hours. Campbeltown's primary mission was accomplished. As Campbeltown came to rest, embedded in the dock gates, commandos aboard the destroyer immediately began disembarking. Under heavy German fire, they crossed the ship's deck and jumped onto the dock structure. The assault teams moved quickly to secure the immediate area, engaging German personnel with small arms fire and grenades. The demolition teams headed directly for their assigned targets. The situation in the harbor had deteriorated severely for the motor launches. Of the 18 launches that entered the Loire estuary, only a fraction successfully reached their designated landing points. German gunfire was concentrated and accurate. Motor launch number 4 was hit and exploded, killing most aboard. Motor launch number 341 caught fire and sank. Multiple other launches were disabled, their engines destroyed or hulls riddled with bullet holes. Those launches that did reach the docks came under immediate attack from German infantry positions. Commandos disembarking had to fight their way off the vessels and onto the dock. Casualties were heavy. Several launches were unable to land their troops at all and were forced to withdraw with commandos still aboard. Despite the chaos, approximately 190 commandos succeeded in landing and organizing for their assigned tasks. Lieutenant Colonel Newman established a command post near the Old Mole, an older dock structure, and began coordinating the assault. Communications were difficult due to noise, darkness, and German fire, but the commandos moved systematically toward their objectives. The demolition teams functioned with remarkable efficiency. These men had trained for months on mock-ups of St. Nazaire's facilities. Despite the hostile environment, they proceeded to their targets and began placing charges. Lieutenant Stuart Chant's team assaulted the northern winding house, which contained the machinery for operating the northern dock gate. They eliminated German defenders, placed explosive charges on the winding gear, and detonated them, destroying the equipment completely. Another team targeted the southern winding house with similar results. The pumping station, which controlled water flow into and out of the dry dock, was attacked and demolished. Hydraulic systems, electrical installations, and various pieces of dock machinery were systematically destroyed. Each demolition was carried out according to plan, with charges placed for maximum destructive effect. German resistance was initially disorganized. The sudden appearance of British commandos inside the heavily fortified base caused confusion. German units responded piecemeal without coordinated command. This allowed the commandos to complete much of their demolition work before facing concentrated opposition. However, as minutes passed, German forces began to organize. Reinforcements arrived from garrison positions throughout St. Nazaire. Infantry companies moved to seal off the dock area. Machine gun positions were established covering the main routes. German officers realized they were facing a commando raid rather than a larger invasion, and they began to methodically compress the British perimeter. By 0200 hours, most primary demolition objectives had been achieved. The winding houses were destroyed, the pumping station was demolished, and dock machinery was wrecked. Lieutenant Colonel Newman assessed the situation. The objective was accomplished, but extraction was becoming increasingly difficult. The harbor was filled with burning motor launches. German fire was intensifying. It was clear that organized evacuation by sea was no longer feasible for most of the force. Newman made the decision to attempt a fighting withdrawal into St. Nazaire town itself. His hope was that small groups might evade German forces in the urban environment and eventually reach Spain or other neutral territory, as had occurred with some personnel after earlier raids. It was a slim hope, but the only alternative was immediate surrender. The commandos began withdrawing from the dock area in small groups. They fought through German positions, using buildings for cover and engaging in close quarters combat. The battle devolved into numerous small unit actions across the dock complex and adjoining streets. German forces, now heavily reinforced and better organized, pursued and engaged each British group. On the water, Commander Ryder, aboard motor gun boat 314, attempted to coordinate the naval withdrawal. His vessel moved through the harbor under heavy fire, searching for survivors from disabled launches and attempting to embark commandos from shore positions. Able seaman William Savage continued firing the pom-pom gun, engaging German positions despite being fully exposed. He was wounded multiple times but remained at his post, continuing to fire until he was killed. His actions provided covering fire that allowed motor gun boat 314 and several motor launches to withdraw from the immediate harbor area. Motor Launch 306, commanded by Lieutenant Ian Henderson, was heavily damaged and lost power. The vessel drifted while German patrol boats closed in. Sergeant Thomas Frank Durant, a Royal Engineer attached to No. 1 Commando, manned a Lewis gun on the launch. As German vessels approached and ordered the British crew to surrender, Durant continued firing. He engaged multiple German boats at close range, inflicting casualties even as German return fire struck him repeatedly. He was wounded so severely that he could barely move, yet he continued to operate his weapon until German soldiers boarded the launch and physically removed him from his gun. Durant died from his wounds shortly after being taken prisoner. The German officers who witnessed his final stand were so impressed by his courage that they later recommended him for the Victoria Cross through Red Cross channels, an unprecedented action. By 02:30 hours, those motor launches still capable of movement began withdrawing from St. Nazaire harbor. They fought their way back down the Loire estuary under continued German fire. Several more launches were lost during the withdrawal. Others, damaged and low on fuel, would not survive the return crossing to England. Behind them in St. Nazaire, the Commandos who had landed were fighting a losing battle. German forces, now numbering several hundred infantry with armored car support, systematically cleared the dock area. Commandos were surrounded in buildings, cut off in small groups, and forced to surrender as ammunition ran out. Lieutenant Colonel Newman led a group that penetrated into the town, fighting through several German positions, but by mid-morning, his group was surrounded and forced to surrender. By 0600 hours on March 28th, fighting in St. Nazaire had largely ceased. The last commando groups either surrendered or went into hiding, hoping to evade capture. German forces controlled the entire dock complex and were conducting systematic searches of the town. The raid appeared to be over, but HMS Campbeltown remained embedded in the Normandie Dock gates, her bow packed with explosives. The fuses continued to count down. Throughout the morning of March 28th, German authorities assessed the damage and organized recovery operations. HMS Campbeltown, firmly wedged into the dock gates, was an obvious priority. Naval engineers and explosive ordnance specialists were ordered to inspect the vessel for demolition charges. The German engineers who boarded Campbeltown found the ship extensively damaged from gunfire but structurally intact. They conducted a thorough search of accessible spaces. The explosive chamber in the bow was concealed behind steel plating and was not immediately obvious. Some inspection teams reported finding suspicious modifications to the ship's structure, but conclusions were not definitive. The prevailing opinion among German officers was that Campbeltown had been intended simply as a ramming weapon, with the impact itself meant to damage the dock gates. By mid-morning, several hundred German personnel were in the immediate vicinity of Campbeltown. Navy personnel continued inspecting the ship. Dockyard workers began assessments for removing the vessel from the gates. Senior officers gathered on the dock to tour the damage and plan recovery operations. British prisoners were being held in nearby facilities. French dockworkers, forced laborers under German control, were present throughout the area. The fuses aboard Campbeltown had been set for 8 hours after impact. 0134 hours plus 8 hours equals 0934 hours, approximately 9:30 in the morning. However, the fuses were not precision instruments. Variations in temperature, handling, and manufacturing tolerances meant the actual detonation time could vary by minutes or even hours. At approximately 11:30 hours, 10 hours after Campbeltown rammed the dock, the explosives detonated. The explosion was massive. 4.5 tons of high explosives, positioned against the critical structural elements of the dock gate, detonated simultaneously. The blast vaporized the forward section of Campbeltown. The dock gates were completely destroyed. The surrounding dock structure sustained severe damage. Debris was hurled hundreds of yards in all directions. German casualties were severe. Estimates vary, but between 200 and 360 German personnel were killed instantly. Many more were wounded. Among the dead were senior naval officers, engineering specialists, and skilled dockyard workers. Some British prisoners of war held near the dock were also killed in the explosion. The blast was heard throughout St. Nazaire and in surrounding areas miles away. Buildings shook from the concussion, windows shattered. A column of smoke and debris rose high above the harbor. German authorities initially believed the explosion resulted from a delayed action bomb dropped during the previous night's Royal Air Force raid. Confusion reigned for several minutes before the true cause was understood. The explosion had a psychological impact beyond the physical destruction. German forces realized they had been examining an explosive-laden ship for hours, completely unaware of the danger. The British had successfully deceived them not once with the initial approach, but twice with the delayed detonation. This caused significant concern among German personnel regarding other captured equipment and facilities.
In the hours following the Campbeltown explosion, German forces became increasingly nervous. When demolition charges planted by Commandos began detonating throughout the dock complex, German troops opened fire on perceived threats, in some cases shooting at shadows or false alarms. Several French civilians were killed in these incidents. The atmosphere in St. Nazaire became one of near panic as German authorities tried to regain control. Meanwhile, the motor launches that had withdrawn from St. Nazaire were facing their own ordeal. The return crossing to England covered 400 miles of ocean patrolled by German aircraft and naval forces. Many launches were damaged, leaking fuel and carrying wounded personnel. As dawn broke on March 28th, German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the retreating vessels and called in attacks. Luftwaffe aircraft, including Messerschmitt Bf-110 fighters and Junkers Ju-88 bombers, attacked the motor launches throughout the day. The small wooden vessels had minimal anti-aircraft armament and no armor protection. Several launches were sunk by bombing and strafing. Others, their fuel exhausted, were forced to surrender to German surface vessels. Of the 18 motor launches and 1 motor gunboat that entered the Loire estuary, only 4 motor launches reached England. Motor gunboat 314, carrying Commander Ryder, successfully returned, as did 3 motor launches. All other naval vessels were lost. The casualty rate among naval personnel exceeded 60%. The 2 escort destroyers, HMS Tynedale and HMS Atherstone, which had remained in the area during the raid, rescued some survivors from disabled launches, but could not remain due to fuel limitations and German air threat. They returned to England with the survivors they had embarked. By March 29th, the full cost of Operation Chariot was becoming clear. Of the 612 men who participated in the raid, 169 were killed in action. This included 64 commandos and 105 naval personnel. 215 men were captured, most of them wounded. Only 228 men returned to England. The casualty rate exceeded 60%, making Operation Chariot one of the costliest commando operations of the war. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for actions during the raid, the highest number for any single action during the Second World War. This reflected both the extraordinary courage displayed and the severity of the fighting. Commander Robert Ryder received the Victoria Cross for his leadership of the naval force and his actions during the withdrawal, particularly his efforts to rescue survivors under fire. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman received the Victoria Cross for his command of the military force and his leadership during the assault and subsequent fighting withdrawal. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty received the Victoria Cross for commanding Campbeltown during her final approach and successfully ramming the dock gates despite severe damage and casualties. Able seaman William Savage received a posthumous Victoria Cross for his actions manning the pom-pom gun aboard motor gun boat 314. Despite being fully exposed to enemy fire and being wounded multiple times, he continued engaging German positions, allowing other vessels to withdraw. His citations specifically noted that the award represented not only his own gallantry, but also that of many other unnamed personnel who displayed similar courage. Sergeant Thomas Frank Durrant received a posthumous Victoria Cross for his actions aboard Motor Launch 306. His continued resistance, even after being severely wounded, and his refusal to surrender until physically incapable of fighting, impressed even his enemies. The recommendation for his decoration, submitted by German officers through the Red Cross and international channels, remains unique in British military history. Numerous other decorations were awarded, including Distinguished Service Orders, Military Crosses, Distinguished Service Crosses, and Conspicuous Gallantry Medals. The high proportion of decorations reflected the exceptional nature of the action and the bravery displayed throughout. For those captured, the war continued in prisoner-of-war camps. Most captured personnel were sent to camps in Germany and Poland. They spent the remainder of the war in captivity, some until 1945. Treatment varied, but generally British commandos were treated according to the Geneva Convention, unlike some other special forces who faced execution under Hitler's commando order issued later in 1942. Several commandos successfully evaded capture. Small groups hid in St. Nazaire, aided by French civilians despite severe German reprisals against anyone assisting escaped prisoners. Some eventually reached networks operated by French resistance organizations. 5 commandos ultimately succeeded in reaching Spain and returning to England, though their journey took weeks or months. The strategic objective of the raid was achieved. German engineers assessed the Normandie Dock and concluded that repairs would take years. The dock gates were completely destroyed, requiring fabrication of entirely new structures. The winding houses and pumping stations would need to be rebuilt. Debris filling the dock would need to be cleared. German authorities lacked the resources and skilled labor to complete such work while simultaneously maintaining war production. In fact, the Normandie Dock remained out of service for the remainder of the Second World War. It was not fully operational again until the 1950s. The raid succeeded in its primary purpose, denying Germany the use of the only Atlantic coast facility capable of servicing ships the size of Tirpitz. The impact on German naval strategy was significant. Tirpitz never ventured into the Atlantic. German Naval Command considered the risk too great without assured access to repair facilities. Tirpitz remained in Norwegian waters throughout her operational life, where she tied down substantial British naval forces but never engaged in the commerce raiding for which she was designed. She was eventually sunk by Royal Air Force bombers using Torbay earthquake bombs in November 1944, while moored in Tromsø Fjord. The absence of Tirpitz from Atlantic waters, ensured by the destruction of St. Nazaire's dock, meant that Allied convoys faced one less existential threat. The Battle of the Atlantic would continue until 1943, with U-boats remaining the primary danger, but the specter of German battleships attacking convoys was greatly reduced. From a military perspective, Operation Chariot demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of commando operations. The raid achieved its strategic objective through detailed planning, specialized training, and extraordinary courage. However, the high casualty rate and near-complete loss of the extraction force highlighted the risks inherent in such operations. The success of the approach phase resulted from several factors. The modification of Campbeltown to resemble a German vessel, combined with the use of captured recognition signals, allowed the force to approach much closer to the objective than would otherwise have been possible. The 6 minutes gained through this deception were critical. Had German guns opened fire earlier, Campbeltown might have been disabled before reaching the dock. The decision to use delayed action fuses was vindicated by results. An immediate explosion would have destroyed the dock gates, but would have killed Campbeltown's crew and many commandos. The delay allowed personnel to evacuate and gave demolition teams time to complete their tasks. Moreover, the delayed explosion caused significantly more German casualties, as personnel who believed the danger had passed were caught in the blast. The demolition phase succeeded because commando teams were thoroughly trained on their specific objectives. Despite darkness, chaos, and German resistance, teams located their targets and placed charges correctly. This level of preparation, with months spent training on detailed mock-ups, proved essential. Improvisation under fire is possible, but thorough preparation is preferable. The extraction phase represented the operation's greatest failure. The motor launches proved too vulnerable to German fire. Their wooden construction offered no protection, and their small size made them difficult to maneuver in confined waters under fire. Alternative extraction methods, such as using submarines for small numbers of key personnel or planning for overland escape routes, might have reduced casualties. However, the constraints of the objective, deep inside a heavily defended harbor, made extraction extremely difficult regardless of method. The decision to proceed despite knowing the odds deserves consideration. Military operations always involve risk, but Operation Chariot had an unusually high expected casualty rate from the planning stage. The justification rested on the strategic value of the objective. Neutralizing Tirpitz without risking major fleet units was considered worth the loss of 1 destroyer, 18 motor launches, and potentially most of the raiding force. This calculation proved correct in strategic terms, as the dock's destruction did indeed keep Tirpitz contained, but the human cost was severe. German defensive failures also warrant examination. Despite heavy fortifications, German forces at St. Nazaire were initially deceived by Campbeltown's disguise. Once the raid began, German response was piecemeal rather than coordinated. The failure to immediately recognize that Campbeltown was an explosive ship resulted in hundreds of German casualties when she detonated. German command and control difficulties allowed British commandos to complete their demolition tasks despite being heavily outnumbered. Following the raid, German authorities significantly increased security at all major port facilities. Recognition procedures were tightened and defensive positions were reinforced. These measures diverted resources and manpower from other duties, representing a secondary benefit of the operation. The raid's propaganda value was substantial for Britain. By mid-1942, British forces had experienced numerous setbacks. The fall of Singapore, losses in North Africa, and the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic had lowered morale. Operation Chariot, despite its high cost, was portrayed as a successful offensive action. The courage displayed by participants and the achievement of the primary objective provided a morale boost at a time when positive news was scarce. From the perspective of special operations doctrine, St. Nazaire reinforced several principles. First, detailed intelligence and thorough planning are essential. Second, specialized training on realistic mock-ups significantly increases chances of success. Third, surprise and deception can allow small forces to achieve objectives against heavily defended targets. Fourth, extraction is often the most difficult phase of deep penetration raids. Fifth, personnel must be prepared to complete the mission even if extraction becomes impossible. The raid influenced planning for subsequent operations. The lessons learned at St. Nazaire were applied to later commando raids and eventually to the D-Day landings in 1944. The concept of using an explosive-laden ship as a weapon was employed in other theaters. The training methods developed for Chariot became standard for special operations units. Operation Chariot occupies a unique place in Second World War history. It represents a type of military operation that balances careful planning with acceptance of extremely high risk. The raid demonstrated that even heavily fortified objectives could be attacked if planners were willing to accept significant casualties. The immediate military impact was clear. The Normandie Dock was destroyed, Tirpitz was contained, and German forces were forced to divert resources to improved harbor defenses. The long-term impact was more subtle but equally important. The raid proved that British forces could conduct offensive operations despite being strategically on the defensive in early 1942. This had implications for Allied strategy, German defensive planning, and the morale of occupied populations who observed that German installations were not invulnerable. The human element of Operation Chariot remains its most compelling aspect. 612 men knowingly sailed into an operation where most expected to die or be captured. They did so because the strategic objective was judged important enough to justify the risk. Their courage, whether displayed in the final charge of Campbeltown, the systematic demolition work of commando teams under fire, or the last stand of men like Savage and Durant, exemplifies a particular form of military valor. The raid also illustrates the complexity of military decision-making. Was Operation Chariot worth the cost? From a purely strategic perspective, the answer is yes. The dock was destroyed, Tirpitz was neutralized, and the strategic situation in the Atlantic improved. From a human perspective, the cost of 169 lives and 215 captured is significant. Both perspectives are valid, and the tension between them reflects the difficult choices inherent in warfare. The memory of Operation Chariot has been preserved through various means. Memorials exist in both England and France. The St. Nazaire Society, formed by survivors and their families, maintained connections between raid participants and educated subsequent generations about the operation. The town of St. Nazaire itself has commemorated the raid, recognizing both the military action and the French civilians who aided escaped commandos despite German reprisals. In military education, the raid on St. Nazaire is studied as an example of special operations planning and execution. The balance between detailed preparation and flexibility in execution, the use of deception to achieve surprise, and the importance of clear mission objectives are all illustrated by this operation. It remains relevant to contemporary military planners considering operations against well-defended objectives. On the night of March 27th to 28th, 1942, 612 men sailed from England to attack one of the most heavily defended installations in occupied Europe. They knew the odds were against them. They understood that most would not return. They went anyway because the strategic objective was judged important enough to justify the risk. Of those 612 men, 169 died. 215 were captured. 228 returned to England. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded, more than for any other single action of the war. The strategic objective was achieved. The Normandie Dock at St. Nazaire was destroyed and remained out of service for the remainder of the war. The battleship Tirpitz, lacking access to Atlantic repair facilities, never ventured into the Atlantic. Allied convoys, while still threatened by U-boats, faced one less existential danger. Operation Chariot, often called the greatest raid of all, succeeded through detailed planning, thorough training, tactical deception, and extraordinary courage. The raid demonstrated what could be achieved by special operations forces properly employed against strategic targets. The cost was high, but the strategic gain was real. The men who participated, whether they returned to England, spent years in prisoner of war camps, or died in the action, accomplished what they set out to do. They destroyed the dock. They neutralized Tirpitz. They proved that even the strongest German fortifications could be breached. Their story remains a testament to the courage and professionalism of the men who served in combined operations during the Second World War, and to the difficult choices that war demands of those who plan and execute military operations.